I was at that exciting age of early adolescence, around 13 years old, when my parents first started trusting me to stay home alone overnight. This was a thrilling development for me, as I finally felt a sense of independence and responsibility. The only condition was that I couldn't leave the house or have anyone over, which I was perfectly fine with. On this particular night, my parents were traveling to attend a relative's wedding in a neighboring city. Before they left, my mom sat me down and went through a detailed list of do's and don'ts. She put a list of important phone numbers on the fridge: emergency services, neighbors, the hotel they'd be staying at. She also left me some pre-prepared meals in the fridge and made sure I promised to eat a proper dinner. As soon as they left, a sense of freedom washed over me. The house was all mine for a whole night. I started by cranking up the music, something I could never do when my dad was home. The bass thumped through the house, and I danced around the living room, reveling in my solitude. The weather that evening seemed to match my mood perfectly. Dark clouds had been gathering all afternoon, and just as night fell, the first drops of rain began to patter against the windows. I've always loved thunderstorms, finding them oddly comforting. I turned off the music and sat by the window, watching as lightning illuminated the sky and thunder rolled in the distance. After enjoying the storm for a while, I decided it was the perfect time to indulge in my favorite pastime, gaming. But not just any gaming session. Tonight, I could play on the big screen. I carefully unplugged my Xbox from my room and carried it downstairs to the den, where my dad's massive flat-screen TV and Bose sound system waited. This was a rare treat, only possible when I had the house to myself. The den was a half flight of stairs down from the living room level with the backyard. The back door was in this room, which would later become a crucial detail. But at that moment, all I cared about was setting up my game. I booted up Black Ops, my favorite game at the time, and joined an online multiplayer party with my friend Cody. The surround sound made every gunshot and explosion feel incredibly real. I had my old headset on, which only allowed me to hear other players in the lobby. For a 13-year-old, this was absolute paradise. Time flew by as Cody and I played match after match. We were on a winning streak, our teamwork honed by countless hours of practice. The storm outside added an extra layer of atmosphere to our intense gaming session. Every now and then, a particularly loud clap of thunder would make me jump, but it only added to the excitement. It must have been past 9 o'clock when something interrupted my gaming bliss. At first, I wasn't sure if I had really heard it over the game sounds. But then it came again, the distinct chime of the doorbell. I paused the game, telling Cody, "Hold up, I think someone's at the door." Cody's voice crackled through my headset, "Dude, it's super late." Who could that be? I wondered the same thing. Could my parents be back early? But no, they had keys. They wouldn't ring the doorbell. A neighbor perhaps, checking on me? But in this weather? "Maybe you should go check," Cody suggested, curiosity evident in his voice. I hesitated. My parents had been very clear about not opening the door to anyone. But surely just checking wouldn't hurt? I told Cody I'd be right back and headed upstairs. Standing in front of the door, I called out, "Who's there?" My voice cracked a little, betraying my nervousness. A male voice responded from the other side, "I need to use a phone." My heart started racing. This wasn't anyone I knew. I didn't answer, instead retreating back downstairs to the den. But I had made a grave mistake. I had let whoever was out there know that someone was home. Back at my game, I quickly told Cody what had happened. His reaction was immediate. "Yo, what the fuck? Don't open the door, man." I assured him I hadn't and wouldn't. We tried to resume our game, but I was distracted now. Every sound from outside made me tense up. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. Cody and I fell silent, listening. After a minute or two of nothing, we breathed sighs of relief. Whoever it was must have left. Gradually, I started to relax again. The game pulled me back in, and soon I was lost in the virtual world once more. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and thunder booming overhead. It was in this moment of renewed calm that it happened. A movement caught my eye, and I turned my head just in time to see the back door closing. A tall figure stepped inside, definitely not my dad. Pure terror gripped me. I dropped the controller, the cord of my headset ripping out as I bolted for the office door. I slammed it shut behind me, fumbling with the lock. The second it clicked into place, the handle rattled violently as someone on the other side tried to open it. My mind raced. The office had 2 doors, one to the den where I'd just come from, and one leading to the garage. That was my only chance to escape. But I couldn't move. I stood frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then came a knock on the door. The man's voice, deceptively calm, called out, "Little boy, I just need to use your phone." I was stranded out in the rain. I remained silent, hoping against hope that he might leave. But instead, the knocking turned to pounding. His voice grew louder, angrier. "Open the door, you little shit," he yelled, the door shaking in its frame as he tried to break it down. I knew I had no choice. I had to get out through the garage. I pressed the button to open the garage door, praying the noise wouldn't alert the intruder. As soon as it was high enough, I ducked under and ran out into the storm. Rain soaked me instantly as I sprinted down the street. I headed for Julian's house, our neighbor a few doors down. I used to play with his dog, Copper, when I was younger. I could hear Copper barking as I frantically rang the doorbell, constantly looking back towards my house. Julian opened the door, confusion turning to concern as he saw my state. I threw myself into his arms, begging for help between sobs. His wife appeared from the kitchen, alarmed by the commotion. As I recounted what had happened, their expressions changed from shock to determination. Julian immediately called the police while his wife wrapped me in a warm blanket and tried to calm me down. The wait for the police felt endless. Julian stayed on the phone with the dispatcher, relaying information and keeping an eye out the window. His wife made me some hot cocoa, which I could barely drink through my shaking hands. Finally, we saw the flashing lights of police cars pulling up outside. Julian and I went out to meet them. I repeated my story to the officers, my voice steadier now but still trembling. When they asked which door was unlocked, I told them about the back door in the den. A couple of officers entered through the garage, guns drawn. The rest of us waited outside in tense silence. After what seemed like an eternity, they emerged with a man in handcuffs. They were careful to keep him from seeing me. Once he was secure in a police car, an officer approached me to ask if I knew the man. I shook my head emphatically. "No, of course I don't know him." The man was clearly intoxicated or possibly on drugs. He was ranting loudly, insisting that it was his house and that I was his son. His behavior was erratic and aggressive, confirming my fear that he was dangerous. The officers informed us that he would be taken to jail and charged with criminal trespass. They would need to contact my parents about how they wanted to proceed with pressing charges. Later, I learned the man's name was John McCarty. While it was somewhat reassuring that this seemed to be a random encounter rather than someone specifically targeting our house, it didn't entirely ease my fears. The thought that this man would one day be out of jail and knew where I lived was terrifying. In the days that followed, my parents took several measures to increase our home security. They installed a more robust alarm system and added extra locks to all the doors. They also had a serious talk with me about safety protocols when home alone. The incident left a lasting impact on me. For weeks, I struggled to sleep, jumping at every sound in the night. My parents arranged for me to see a counselor to help process the trauma. Gradually, with support from my family and professionals, I began to feel safe in my own home again. This experience taught me valuable lessons about personal safety and the importance of following rules set by parents. It also made me appreciate the security of having my family around. While I eventually regained the privilege of staying home alone, it was never quite the same carefree experience it had been before. Years later, as an adult, I still think about that night sometimes. It serves as a reminder of how quickly a normal situation can turn dangerous, and the importance of being prepared and aware of one's surroundings. While it was a frightening experience, I'm grateful for the quick thinking that helped me escape and the support I received in the aftermath. The story of that stormy night has become a part of our family lore, retold at gatherings as a cautionary tale. It's a stark reminder that even in seemingly safe environments, unexpected dangers can arise. But it's also a story of resilience, of how a scared teenager managed to keep his wits about him in a crisis. Today, my parents still live in that house. When I visit, I can't help but glance at that back door in the den, remembering the fear I felt seeing it open that night. But I also remember the strength I found within myself, the kindness of our neighbors, and the efficiency of the emergency services that came to my aid. This experience has shaped my approach to home security in my own adult life. I'm perhaps more cautious than most, always double-checking locks and being wary of unexpected visitors. But I've also learned not to let fear control my life. Instead, I've channeled that experience into being prepared and aware, skills that have served me well in various aspects of my life. In the end, what could have been a tragic story became one of survival and growth. It's a night I'll never forget, but also one that I've learned to move beyond, carrying its lessons with me as I navigate the world. The night that changed everything started like any other. I was up late, browsing the internet and listening to the rain patter against my window. It was a typical evening for me, a writer struggling to find inspiration in the quiet solitude of a remote cabin in the Pisgah National Forest. I'd rented the place for a month, hoping the isolation would spark my creativity and help me finish my novel. As the clock ticked past midnight, the storm outside intensified. Wind howled through the trees, and thunder rumbled in the distance. I found myself glancing nervously at the windows, half expecting to see something peering in from the darkness. I shook off the feeling, chiding myself for letting my imagination run wild. Just as I was considering turning in for the night, the power flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to navigate to the kitchen where I kept a flashlight and some candles. As I lit a few candles around the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cabin creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind, sounds that had become familiar over the past few weeks but now seemed ominous in the storm-tossed night. I tried to focus on my writing, jotting down ideas by candlelight, but my mind kept wandering to the shadows dancing on the walls. It was nearing 2 a.m. when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears. But then I heard it again, a faint, muffled cry coming from somewhere outside. My heart raced as I moved to the window, peering out into the rain-soaked darkness. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the forest beyond the cabin's small clearing. For a split second, I thought I saw movement among the trees, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The cry came again, louder this time. It sounded like a voice calling for help. Despite every instinct telling me to stay inside, I found myself reaching for my raincoat and flashlight. What if someone was really out there, lost or hurt? I couldn't just ignore it. As I stepped onto the porch, the full force of the storm hit me. Rain lashed at my face, and the wind threatened to knock me off my feet. I swept my flashlight beam across the yard, seeing nothing but wind-whipped trees and shadows. "Hello?" I called out, my voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Is anyone there?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then, just as I was about to retreat back into the safety of the cabin, I heard it again. A voice, faint but clear, calling from the woods. "Help me. Please." Without thinking, I plunged into the forest. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks, the underbrush tearing at my clothes. The voice seemed to be moving, always just ahead of me, leading me deeper into the woods. I don't know how long I followed that voice. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the storm-tossed forest. My clothes were soaked through, my hands numb with cold. But still, I pressed on, driven by the desperate cries for help. It wasn't until I found myself in a small clearing that I realized something was terribly wrong. The voice had stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the forest. Even the storm seemed to have quieted, though I could still hear rain pattering on the leaves above. As I swept my flashlight around the clearing, my blood ran cold. There, carved into the trunk of a massive old oak tree, was a symbol I didn't recognize, a series of interlocking spirals that seemed to writhe and move in the shifting light. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. What I saw in that moment defied explanation. It was a figure, vaguely human in shape but wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. And its eyes, God, its eyes, they glowed with an otherworldly light that filled me with a primal, overwhelming terror. I ran. I ran like I've never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me at every step, but I didn't slow down. I could hear something moving behind me, keeping pace effortlessly. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, I burst out of the tree lane and saw the welcome side of my cabin. I sprinted across the clearing, fumbling with the keys as I reached the door. As I finally got it open and slammed it shut behind me, I caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the forest, a tall, impossibly thin silhouette with glowing eyes fixed directly on me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the cabin, every light I could find turned on, jumping at every creak and groan. As dawn finally broke, I threw my belongings into my car and sped away, not even bothering to lock up or check out properly. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just an elaborate hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. Maybe I'd fallen asleep at my desk and had an incredibly vivid nightmare. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I'd encountered in those woods was real, and it defied any rational explanation. I never returned to that cabin, never finished my novel. For weeks after, I jumped at every shadow, flinched at every unexpected sound. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever I'd encountered in the forest had followed me home. It wasn't until months later, when I'd finally started to feel somewhat normal again, that I discovered something that chilled me to my core. While researching folklore of the Appalachian region for a new writing project, I came across a local legend about the Pisgah National Forest. It spoke of ancient, otherworldly beings that dwelled in the deepest parts of the woods, beings that could mimic human voices to lure unsuspecting victims into their realm. As I stared at the crude illustration accompanying the legend, a spindly, inhuman figure with glowing eyes, I felt the familiar icy grip of fear close around my heart. What I'd experienced that night wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was something old, something dangerous, something that had been lurking in those woods long before humans ever set foot there. I've never spoken publicly about what happened to me in the Pisgah National Forest. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And I know that out there, in the dark heart of the forest, something is waiting, watching. And occasionally, when the conditions are just right, it calls out into the night, hoping to lure another unsuspecting soul into its domain. So if you ever find yourself in a cabin in the woods, and you hear a voice calling for help in the middle of the night, remember my story. And whatever you do, don't follow it into the dark. The experience in the Pisgah National Forest changed me in ways I'm still coming to understand. For months after the incident, I struggled with nightmares and anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even in the safety of my own home. I found myself obsessively researching folklore and legends, trying to make sense of what I'd encountered. My writing suffered. The novel I'd gone to the cabin to finish remained unfinished, abandoned like the cabin itself. Instead, I filled notebook after notebook with frantic scribblings, attempts to capture the details of that night before they faded from memory, theories about what I'd seen, sketches of the strange symbol I'd found carved into the tree. I became something of a recluse, withdrawing from friends and family. How could I explain what was haunting me? Who would believe me? I was afraid they'd think I was losing my mind, and sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, I wondered if they might be right. It was during this time that I stumbled across an online forum dedicated to unexplained phenomena in the Appalachian region. At first, I was skeptical. Most of the posts seemed like obvious hoaxes or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. But then I found a thread about the Pisgah National Forest, and my blood ran cold. There were others. Not many, but enough to make me realize I wasn't alone in what I'd experienced. They told stories chillingly similar to mine: voices in the night, strange symbols, encounters with beings that defied explanation. Some had photos blurry, indistinct, but enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I created an anonymous account and shared my story. The response was overwhelming. People reached out, offering support, sharing their own experiences, providing information about the legends and folklore of the region. For the first time since that terrifying night, I felt a sense of connection, of validation. Through the forum, I was introduced to a small group of researchers who had been investigating these phenomena for years. They were a mix of academics, folklorists, and ordinary people who had their own encounters with the unexplained. They approached the subject with a level of seriousness and scientific rigor that I found comforting. Over time, I began to work with them, sharing the details of my experience and helping to document other encounters. We pored over historical records, interviewed locals, and even organized expeditions into the more remote areas of the forest. Always careful, always in groups, and never at night. What we found both fascinated and terrified me. The history of strange occurrences in the Pisgah National Forest stretched back centuries. Native American legends spoke of spirits in the woods that could take on human form. Early settlers told stories of people vanishing without a trace, of strange lights seen deep in the forest, of voices that lured the unwary to their doom. As we dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. The encounters seemed to cluster around certain areas of the forest, often near ancient Native American sites or places with a history of geological instability. The symbol I'd seen carved into the tree turned up in other accounts, sometimes in photographs of rock formations or ancient pottery fragments. But for every answer we found, a dozen new questions arose. What were these beings? Where did they come from? What did they want? And perhaps most chillingly, why did they seem to be becoming more active in recent years? Our research took us down some strange paths. We explored theories ranging from interdimensional beings to undiscovered species, from mass hallucinations to secret government experiments. Each seemed as unlikely as the last, yet none could fully explain what we were documenting. As our work progressed, I found myself changing. The fear that had dominated my life since that night in the forest began to transform into something else: a burning curiosity, a drive to understand. I started writing again, not fiction this time, but detailed accounts of our findings and theories. But with this growing obsession came new dangers. There were those who didn't want our research to continue. We received threatening messages, our equipment was vandalized, and on more than one occasion, we felt like we were being followed during our expeditions. It wasn't just human interference we had to worry about. The more we delved into these mysteries, the more we seemed to attract the attention of something else. Team members reported strange occurrences at their homes, unexplained noises, shadowy figures seen out of the corner of the eye, a pervasive feeling of being watched. I was not immune. There were nights when I'd wake up in a cold sweat, certain that I'd heard that familiar voice calling out to me. I'd find my notebooks filled with writing I didn't remember doing, the pages covered in endless repetitions of that strange spiral symbol. Despite the risks, we pressed on. We felt we were on the verge of uncovering something monumental, something that could change our understanding of the world and our place in it. But we also knew we were treading a dangerous path, pushing into realms where perhaps humans were not meant to go. As I sit here now, writing this account, I'm acutely aware of the weight of the knowledge we've accumulated. Part of me wants to shout it from the rooftops, to make the world aware of what lurks in the shadows of our reality. But another part, a wiser part perhaps, understands the danger of such revelations. So I'll leave you with this: the world is stranger and more mysterious than most people realize. There are things out there, in the deep woods and forgotten places, that defy our understanding of reality. If you ever find yourself face to face with these mysteries, remember that knowledge is power, but it's also a responsibility. And if you're ever in the Pisgah National Forest, and you hear a voice calling out in the night, remember my story. Stay in the light. Stay safe. And whatever you do, don't follow the voice into the dark. The years since my encounter in the Pisgah National Forest have been a journey of discovery, not just about the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of our world, but about myself. The person I was before that fateful night feels like a stranger to me now. I'm naive, unprepared for the reality that exists just beyond the veil of our everyday perceptions. My work with the research team has become my life's passion. We've expanded our investigations beyond the Pisgah, following leads across the Appalachian region and beyond. Each new discovery, each piece of evidence we uncover, feels like another piece of an impossibly vast puzzle. We've documented hundreds of encounters, ranging from fleeting glimpses of unexplainable entities to full-blown interactions that left witnesses forever changed. We've collected physical evidence, strange artifacts, soil samples with unexplainable properties, recordings of sounds that shouldn't exist in nature. But for every bit of progress we make, new challenges arise. The more we uncover, the more resistance we face. It's not just the threatening messages or the equipment sabotage anymore. We've had team members disappear, only to return days or weeks later with no memory of where they've been. Others have left the project abruptly, refusing to speak about their reasons, the fear evident in their eyes. And always, there's the sense that we're being watched. Not just by whatever entities we're investigating, but by others who have their own agendas. Government agencies, private corporations, religious groups all seem to have a vested interest in either suppressing our findings or co-opting them for their own purposes. The toll on my personal life has been significant. Relationships have fallen by the wayside, unable to withstand the weight of secrecy and obsession that now defines my existence. There are nights when I lie awake, wondering if I've gone too far, if the cost of this knowledge is too high. But then I remember the eyes of that entity in the forest, the impossible wrongness of its form, and I know I can't stop. The world needs to know the truth, even if I'm not sure what that truth is yet. Our most recent breakthrough came just a few months ago. We'd been investigating a series of disappearances in a small town on the outskirts of the Pisgah. The pattern was familiar: people venturing into the woods and never returning, strange sounds reported in the night, glimpses of something not quite human lurking at the edge of town. What we found there shook us to our core. In a cave system deep in the forest, we discovered what can only be described as a threshold, a place where the fabric of reality itself seemed to thin. The air shimmered with an otherworldly light, and we could hear something on the other side. Voices, maybe, or something merely pretending to be voices. We didn't dare cross over, we're not that foolish. But we set up monitoring equipment, hoping to gather data on whatever was happening at this site. What we've recorded so far defies explanation. Energy readings off the charts, sound frequencies that shouldn't exist in nature, glimpses of shapes that seem to shift and change as you look at them. But perhaps most chilling of all was what we found carved into the cave walls. That same spiral symbol I'd seen years ago, but here it was part of a larger design, a map or a diagram of some kind. We're still working on deciphering it, but what we've unraveled so far suggests something monumental, a plan, perhaps, or a prophecy, involving our world and something else. As I write this, I'm preparing for another expedition to the cave. We're taking every precaution we can, but I can't shake the feeling that we're approaching a point of no return. Whatever is happening in the Pisgah, whatever has been lurking in those woods for centuries, I think it's building to something. Something big. I don't know what we'll find when we return to that cave. Part of me is terrified, remembering the primal fear I felt during my first encounter years ago. But another part, a larger part, is exhilarated. We stand on the brink of a discovery that could change everything we think we know about the nature of reality. To anyone reading this, the world is vaster and stranger than you can imagine. There are layers to reality that most people never see, forces at work beyond our comprehension. But knowledge is power, and understanding is the first step towards, well, I'm not sure what. Protection? Preparation? Or perhaps something even greater. If you ever find yourself face to face with the unknown, remember this: fear is natural, but curiosity is human. Question everything, document what you can, and never, ever assume you know the full story. The mysteries of this world, and perhaps others, are waiting to be uncovered. Just be careful where you shine your light. Some shadows are better left unexplored. The drive home that Sunday was tense and quiet. Cass and I were both exhausted, having barely slept after the terrifying events of the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face pressed against the kitchen window, heard the banging on the walls of the mobile home. I could tell from Cass's tight grip on the steering wheel and her constant checking of the rearview mirror that she was just as shaken as I was. We'd been dating for about 2 years now, Cass and I. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue. She spilled her drink on me. I made a terrible joke about it, and somehow that led to us talking for hours. She was smart, funny, and had this infectious laugh that could light up a room. I fell for her hard and fast. This weekend getaway was supposed to be a chance for us to reconnect, to escape the pressures of our jobs and the city. Cass had been working long hours at the hospital. She was a nurse in the ER, and the stress was starting to wear on her. I had my own struggles at the law firm where I worked, drowning in paperwork and the constant pressure to bill more hours. We thought a quiet weekend in nature would be just what we needed. How wrong we were. We stopped at a diner about halfway home, more out of a need to be around other people than actual hunger. As we sat in a booth, sipping coffee that tasted like cardboard, we finally started to process what had happened. "Do you think we should have called the police?" Cass asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. With no cell reception and those people outside, it wouldn't have been safe to leave. Besides, by the time anyone got there, they'd have been long gone. She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. What if they come back? What if they do that to someone else? It was a thought that had been gnawing at me since we left. I promised her I'd report it to the local sheriff's office once we got home, even though I knew how it would sound. A couple of city folks spooked by noises in the woods during a storm? They'd probably write it off as wildlife or an overactive imagination. But I knew what I'd seen. What we'd both heard. Those weren't animals out there. As we continued our drive home, I couldn't help but replay the events of the previous night in my mind. It had started off so normal, so peaceful. We arrived at the mobile home Friday evening, just as the sun was setting. The place belonged to my family. My grandfather had bought it years ago as a fishing retreat, and now it was mostly used for the occasional weekend getaway. It was a simple place, nothing fancy. Just a small, 2-bedroom mobile home set in a clearing in the woods, about a mile from the nearest lake. But it had always felt safe to me, a refuge from the world. Until now. Friday night had been quiet. We'd grilled some steaks, shared a bottle of wine, and sat out on the deck watching the stars come out. We talked about our future, maybe getting a place together, the possibility of marriage down the line. It felt good, like we were finally on the same page. Saturday had been spent hiking and exploring the woods. We'd packed a picnic lunch and found a beautiful spot by a small stream. Cass had laughed as I tried to skip stones across the water, failing miserably. It was the most relaxed I'd seen her in months. It wasn't until we got back to the mobile home that evening that things started to feel off. At first, it was just little things. A chair on the deck that had moved slightly. A window that I could have sworn I'd closed was now open a crack. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. We made dinner, some pasta dish that Cass had been wanting to try out. As we ate, I noticed her glancing out the window more and more frequently. "Everything okay?" I asked. She shrugged, trying to play it off. "Yeah, just thought I saw something move out there. Probably just a deer or something." I got up and looked out the window, peering into the darkness. The woods seemed still, but there was something about the shadows that made me uneasy. I drew the curtains, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. We cleaned up dinner and settled in to watch a movie on my laptop. About halfway through, the wind picked up outside. We could hear branches scraping against the side of the mobile home, a sound that had never bothered me before but now set my teeth on edge. Then came the first knock. It was soft, almost hesitant. If the movie had been any louder, we might not have heard it. Cass and I looked at each other, both hoping the other would say they'd just imagined it. "Knock. Knock. Knock. Louder this time, more insistent. Coming from the front door. Should we answer it? Cass whispered, her face pale in the blue light of the laptop screen. I shook my head. It's probably nothing. Maybe a branch blown by the wind. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. That sound was deliberate, purposeful. Someone, or something, was out there, wanting to get in. The knocking continued, moving around the mobile home. Front door, side window, back door. Over and over, in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the knocking. We sat there, barely breathing, straining to hear any sound from outside. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Just as we started to relax, thinking maybe it was over, we heard it. A voice, right outside the kitchen window. It was speaking in a language I didn't recognize, the words guttural and harsh. And then, pressed against the glass, we saw the face. It was pale, so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness. The features were wrong somehow, like they'd been put together by someone who'd only ever had human faces described to them. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide. And when it smiled, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth, I felt a primal fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Cass screamed. I grabbed her hand and pulled her into the bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind us. We could hear more voices now, coming from all around the mobile home. And then the banging started. It was relentless, shaking the entire structure. We huddled together on the bed, holding each other tight, praying for it to stop. I don't know how long it went on, it could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The voices, the banging, all of it, gone. Replaced by an eerie silence that was almost as terrifying. We stayed in that room all night, too afraid to leave. When the first light of dawn finally started to filter through the window, we made a run for the car, not even bothering to pack our things. We just needed to get out of there. Now, sitting in this diner, trying to make sense of what had happened, I realized how unbelievable it all sounded. If someone had told me this story, I'd have thought they were exaggerating or flat out lying. But I knew what we'd experienced was real. The fear was real. The danger was real. As we finished our coffee and prepared to get back on the road, I could see the same questions in Cass's eyes that were running through my mind. What were those things? Why did they come after us? And most importantly, would they be back? The rest of the drive home was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we finally reached our apartment, it felt like we'd been gone for months rather than just a weekend. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but instead, they felt alien and unsafe. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every unexpected sound made us jump. That night, neither of us slept much. We left the lights on, the TV playing softly in the background, anything to keep the silence at bay. Cass curled up next to me on the couch, her head on my chest. I could feel her trembling slightly, and I held her tighter, wishing I could protect her from the fear that now seemed to permeate every aspect of our lives. The next few weeks were rough. Cass had nightmares, often waking up in a cold sweat, convinced she could hear footsteps outside our apartment. I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly looking over my shoulder. We both threw ourselves into work, trying to keep busy, to avoid thinking about that night. I did call the sheriff's office, as promised. The deputy I spoke to was polite but skeptical. He took down the details and promised to increase patrols in the area, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. I couldn't blame him. If someone had told me this story a month ago, I'd have thought they were exaggerating or flat out lying. Work became both a refuge and a source of stress. I buried myself in cases, staying late at the office, taking on extra projects. Anything to keep my mind occupied. But the lack of sleep and constant state of anxiety began to take its toll. I started making mistakes, missing deadlines. My colleagues noticed, of course. They attributed it to stress, maybe relationship problems. If only they knew the truth. Cass wasn't faring much better. She'd always been passionate about her work as a nurse, finding fulfillment in helping others. But now, the long hours and high-stress environment of the ER were wearing her down. She'd come home exhausted, both physically and emotionally. We tried to support each other, but it felt like we were both drowning, barely keeping our heads above water. Our relationship began to strain under the weight of our shared trauma. We'd always been good at communicating, at working through problems together. But now, there was this unspoken thing between us, this experience that we couldn't fully process or explain. We started arguing over little things, dishes left in the sink, a forgotten errand. It wasn't really about those things, of course. It was about the fear, the uncertainty, the feeling that our world had been turned upside down and we didn't know how to right it. About a month after the incident, I received a call from my dad. He'd been up to the mobile home for a weekend fishing trip and noticed some things were off. There were scratches around the door lock, like someone had tried to force their way in. One of the window screens had been partially torn away. And most disturbingly, he'd found a small cairn of rocks on the deck, arranged in a way that he said just didn't look natural. That call brought it all flooding back. The fear, the uncertainty, the feeling of violation. Cass and I had been trying to move past it, to convince ourselves it was just a one-time scare, but now it was clear, whatever had happened that night, it wasn't over. I didn't tell Cass about the call right away. I told myself I was protecting her, that she didn't need the added stress. But deep down, I knew I was just afraid. Afraid of facing it all again, afraid of what it might do to us. When I finally did tell her, a few days later, her reaction surprised me. Instead of the fear or anxiety I expected, she seemed almost relieved. Like having confirmation that it wasn't all in our heads was somehow comforting. "We need to go back," she said, her voice steady. I stared at her, not sure I'd heard correctly. "Go back? To the mobile home? After everything that happened?" She nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "We can't keep living like this, jumping at every shadow, afraid of our own memories. We need answers." Part of me knew she was right. The not knowing was eating away at us, destroying our peace of mind, our relationship. But the thought of going back there, of potentially facing those things again, terrified me. "I don't know, Cass," I said, running a hand through my hair. "It could be dangerous. What if they're still out there? What if they are?" She countered. "Don't we deserve to know? To understand what happened to us?" We argued about it for days. I tried to convince her it was too risky, that we should just try to move on. She insisted that moving on wasn't possible until we confronted what had happened. In the end, we reached a compromise. We'd go back, but not right away. We'd take some time to prepare, both mentally and practically. Over the next few weeks, we did our research. I found myself obsessing over the details of that night, trying to make sense of it all. I scoured local news reports, looking for any similar incidents. I joined online forums dedicated to strange encounters in the wilderness. Most of what I found was clearly fictional or the product of overactive imaginations, but there were a few accounts that rang true, that echoed elements of our experience. One story in particular caught my attention. A hiker described being stalked through the woods by figures in bright clothing that moved in unnaturally fluid ways. He spoke of hearing voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, calling out in a language he couldn't understand. The similarities to our experience were chilling. Cass, meanwhile, took a more practical approach. She signed us up for a self-defense class, insisting that we needed to be prepared for anything. She also started researching survival techniques, learning about edible plants in the area, how to purify water, how to build a shelter. It was like she was preparing for war. As we prepared, I noticed a change in Cass. The fear that had been haunting her since that night seemed to be transforming into something else, determination, maybe even a kind of excitement. She threw herself into our preparations with an intensity that both impressed and worried me. "Are you sure about this?" I asked her one night, as we pored over maps of the area around the mobile home. "We don't have to do this, you know. We could just sell the place, never go back. She looked up at me, her eyes bright with a fervor I hadn't seen in months. I'm sure. We need this. I need this. Don't you want to know the truth? The truth. It was something I both craved and dreaded. What if the truth was worse than not knowing? What if it changed everything? But I couldn't deny the change I was seeing in Cass. For the first time since that night, she seemed alive, purposeful. And I realized that maybe this wasn't just about finding answers. Maybe it was about reclaiming our lives, refusing to be victims of our own fear. So we continued to prepare. We bought new camping gear, including a tent in case we didn't feel safe staying in the mobile home. We invested in a high-powered flashlight and a set of walkie-talkies. Cass even managed to borrow a night vision monocular from a friend who was into hunting. As the days ticked by, leading up to our planned return to the mobile home, I found my anxiety growing. I had vivid nightmares, reliving that night over and over, each time with a different, more terrifying outcome. In one, I opened the door to find a crowd of those pale, long-faced creatures. In another, Cass disappeared into the woods, and no matter how much I searched, I couldn't find her. The night before we were set to leave, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. Cass was already awake, sitting up in bed beside me. Another nightmare, she asked softly, reaching out to take my hand. I nodded, trying to slow my breathing. I don't know if I can do this, Cass. Maybe we should just forget about it, try to move on. She was quiet for a moment, her thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. Then she spoke, her voice low but firm. We can't move on. Not really. It's always going to be there, in the back of our minds, haunting us. We need to face it, whatever it is. Together. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the strength there, the determination. And I realized that she was right. We couldn't keep living in fear, letting one night define our entire lives. We had to face this, for better or worse. Okay, I said, squeezing her hand. Together. The next morning, we loaded up the car and set off. The drive felt different this time. There was tension, yes, but also a sense of purpose. We weren't running away anymore. We were running towards something, even if we didn't know exactly what that something was. As we neared the turnoff for the mobile home, I felt my heart rate pick up. Memories of that night flashed through my mind, the knocking, the face at the window, the inhuman voices. But I pushed them aside, focusing on the road ahead. We pulled up to the mobile home just as the sun was starting to set. The clearing looked exactly as I remembered it, but somehow everything felt different. The trees seemed to loom larger, their shadows stretching towards us like grasping fingers. The mobile home itself sat silent and still, betraying no hint of the terror we'd experienced there. Ready? Cass asked, her voice steady despite the tension I could see in her shoulders. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. We got out of the car, the crunch of gravel under our feet sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet of the forest. I grabbed our bags from the trunk while Cass did a quick perimeter check, just like we'd planned. All clear, she reported when she returned. No signs of any disturbances. We approached the front door cautiously. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking slightly. When we finally got inside, we both let out a breath we hadn't realized we'd been holding. Everything looked normal. Ordinary. It was hard to believe that this was the same place where we'd experienced such terror. We set about securing the place, just as we'd planned. New locks on all the doors and windows. Motion-activated lights installed at each corner of the home. Cameras set up to cover every approach. It was probably overkill, but it made us feel safer. As night fell, we sat on the deck, watching the woods grow dark. We decided to stay outside, thinking it might be easier to spot anything approaching. I had my rifle across my lap, and Cass held a heavy flashlight, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. Hours passed with nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. An owl hooted in the distance. Wind rustled through the leaves. A small animal, probably a raccoon, scurried through the underbrush. Maybe it was just a one-time thing, Cass said softly, breaking the silence. Maybe they're gone. I wanted to believe her, but something deep in my gut told me it wasn't over. We were missing something, some crucial piece of the puzzle. It was nearing midnight when we heard it. A twig snapping in the woods, too loud to be a small animal. Then another. And another. Something was moving towards the clearing. We both stood, weapons at the ready. I strained my eyes, trying to see into the darkness beyond the reach of our lights. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I saw movement. A flash of pale skin. A glint of two sharp teeth. "They're here," I whispered, my mouth dry with fear. Cass nodded, her grip tightening on the flashlight. "What do we do?" I realized I hadn't thought this far ahead. Part of me wanted to run, to get in the car and drive away as fast as we could. But another part, a stronger part, knew we had to face this. It was why we'd come back, after all. "We wait," I said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "Let them make the first move." We didn't have to wait long. From the woods came that same guttural language we'd heard before, harsh and inhuman. And then they emerged into the clearing. There were 3 of them, tall and impossibly thin, their pale skin seeming to glow in the moonlight. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost as if they were floating rather than walking. Their faces were just as I remembered, features too large, too exaggerated to be human, with those terrible sharp-toothed grins. They stopped at the edge of our lights, just watching us. I raised my rifle, aiming it at the one in the center. "That's far enough," I called out, proud that my voice only shook a little. "What do you want?" For a long moment, they were silent. Then the one in the center spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that somehow carried clearly across the clearing. "We want to understand." I blinked, caught off guard. Of all the things I'd expected them to say, that wasn't it. "Understand what?" I asked. "You," it replied. "Your kind. We have watched for so long, but we do not understand." Beside me, Cass lowered her flashlight slightly. "You're studying us?" she asked, disbelief clear in her voice. The creature tilted its head, the movement jerky and bird-like. "Study? Yes. We observe. We learn. But there is much we do not comprehend." I felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in my throat. All this time, all this fear, and they were just curious. It seemed absurd, and yet, looking at these strange beings, I could believe it. They were so clearly not of our world. Of course they wouldn't understand us. "Why the violence?" I asked, remembering the terror of that night. "Why try to break in?" The creature made a sound that might have been a sigh. "We did not intend harm. We sought closer observation. We did not know it would cause fear." I lowered my rifle slightly, my mind reeling. This was so far from what I'd expected, from what I'd feared. These beings weren't monsters, not really. They were something so much stranger, so much more alien than I could have imagined. Cass stepped forward, her natural compassion seemingly overriding her fear. "If you want to understand us, why not just talk to us? Like we're doing now?" The creatures exchanged looks, a silent communication passing between them. Then the one in the center spoke again. "We did not know how. Your ways are strange to us. We are learning." And so began one of the strangest conversations of my life. We talked for hours, there on the deck of the mobile home. The creatures, who called themselves something unpronounceable in their own language, asked questions about everything. Why we slept at night. Why we lived in fixed dwellings. What we ate and why. In turn, we asked our own questions. Where they came from, another dimension, as far as we could understand. How long they'd been here, longer than human civilization. Why they looked the way they did, an attempt to mimic human form that didn't quite succeed. As the night wore on, I felt my fear gradually being replaced by a sense of wonder. These beings were so utterly different from us, and yet in some ways, so similar. They were driven by curiosity, by a desire to learn and understand. Wasn't that a fundamentally human trait? As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the creatures prepared to leave. "We must go," their spokesperson said. "Sunlight is uncomfortable for us. Will you come back?" Cass asked. I was surprised to hear a note of eagerness in her voice. The creature did something with its face that I think was meant to be a smile. "If you wish it. We have much yet to learn." And then they were gone, melting back into the woods with that same unnatural grace. Cass and I sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun rise, trying to process everything that had happened. "Well," I said finally, "I guess we got our answers. Just not the ones we were expecting." Cass laughed, a sound of relief and lingering disbelief. "No kidding. What do we do now?" I thought about it for a moment. The fear that had been haunting us for months was gone, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Excitement? Anticipation? "I guess we keep learning," I said. "From them and about them." She nodded, reaching over to take my hand. "Together?" I squeezed her hand, feeling truly at peace for the first time since that terrifying night. "Together," I agreed. As we packed up to head home, I realized that our world had changed irrevocably. We now knew, without a doubt, that we were not alone in the universe. That there were things out there beyond our understanding. It should have been terrifying. But instead, I felt a sense of excitement, of possibility. The mobile home, once a place of terror, had become something else entirely. A bridge between worlds. A place of learning and discovery. And as we drove away, I found myself looking forward to our next visit, to the conversations yet to come. The fear that had defined us for so long was gone. In its place was a sense of wonder, a thirst for knowledge. We had faced our fears and found something extraordinary on the other side. Whatever came next, we would face it together, with open minds and curious hearts. As we rejoined the main road, leaving the forest behind, I glanced at Cass. She was looking out the window, a small smile on her face. I realized that this experience had changed us both, had brought us closer together in ways I never could have anticipated. "What are you thinking?" I asked her. She turned to me, her eyes bright with excitement. "I'm thinking about all the questions I want to ask next time. About their world, their society, their understanding of the universe. There's so much we could learn from them." I nodded, feeling a similar excitement building in me. And so much we could teach them about us. It's like a cultural exchange program. Just on a much bigger scale than anyone ever imagined. We spent the rest of the drive home discussing possibilities, making plans. We'd need to figure out a way to communicate more effectively with the beings. Maybe we could set up regular meeting times. We'd have to be careful, of course. The world wasn't ready to know about our new friends, acquaintances, whatever they were. As we pulled up to our apartment, I realized something. The nightmares, the constant fear, the feeling of being watched, all of that was gone. In its place was a sense of purpose, of being part of something much larger than ourselves. We had set out to confront our fears, to find answers. We had found so much more. A new understanding of the universe, of our place in it. A renewed connection with each other. And a future filled with possibilities we had never imagined. As we walked into our apartment, hand in hand, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. With open minds, brave hearts, and a newfound appreciation for the vast, strange, wonderful universe we lived in. The mobile home in the woods was no longer a place of fear. It had become a gateway to a new world, a new understanding. And we were just at the beginning of our journey. We've reached the end of today's video on Dr. Spooks. We hope the story sparked your curiosity and took you into the dark world of horror. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest updates. Share the video with your friends if you'd like to share these terrifying moments with them. Next time, we'll be back with new stories that bring fear and suspense, so don't miss it. See you in the next video. Stay safe and avoid the darkness. Dr. Spooks will always be waiting for you in the dark times and places.